My name is Simeon Bannister, and I'm President and CEO at Rochester Area Community Foundation. One of the critical tools that we enjoy in our community is Act Rochester, which has documented not only the challenges and issues of our community, but many of the opportunities that are in our community. We're excited that the State of Black Rochester will not just document challenges and problems that beset Black people in Rochester, but will also look at the assets that are embedded in the community, will build on those assets, and will look at opportunities for us to continue to grow. The last iteration of the State of Black Rochester was a single book, and things have evolved since then. Now we have social media and we have all kinds of different ways of getting the word out. And so we're excited that this version is going to take advantage of all those channels, that we will offer a multifaceted opportunity for folks to learn about the State of Black Rochester.
The holiday Kwanzaa has now entered the mainstream. And of course, Kwanzaa celebrates the Nguzo Saba, the 7 principles. The second of those principles, Kuja Chakalia, calls on Black people to define ourselves, to name ourselves, to create for ourselves, and to speak for ourselves. There's no better representation of that principle than Phyllis Wheatley, the first Black woman to publish a book in the United States of America. Phyllis Wheatley's work allows us the opportunity to define ourselves and to create new narratives. In this section, we ask people about the emerging narratives here in Rochester about Black people, especially in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic and the murders of George Floyd nationally and Daniel Prude here locally.
I think COVID-19 opened our eyes to what has already been present, what has always been present, but we were too busy to see and to notice.
You know, when we hit the streets and started talking to people about COVID, this before we could vaccinate or before we could even test, yet we had some people who had automatic blood pressure cuffs and pulse oximeters that I couldn't even order in my office at that time. So we saw this big gap, you know, in between the haves and have-nots. If you recall, even when testing was available, there were certain groups of people that were able to get the tests and others couldn't. I think most of us have stories of people who went to the hospital and were told, just go home and, you know, call us and then died at home.
Lack of access to capital, housing instability, challenges with trying to educate our young people. The idea of folks trying to go to work or being mandated to go to work because they were essential workers, being more exposed to the pandemic and the sickness that it imparted, being traumatized because of the number of losses disproportionately impacting our community.
I just remember that, you know, we had to go out and put a call out for our members to make masks. You know, we set up makeshift tables on the corners of streets and in McDonald's parking lots, and we made sure that Black people had a mask to put on because there weren't resources pouring into their communities in the ways that it was pouring into white communities.
So some of the things that we did were webinars just to inform folks, what is COVID-19? In New York City, you saw piles of people going to the doctors, dying. That's scary. And so we saw that this was an opportunity to educate, inform, and make sure our community had what it needed to survive.
I was on the front line. I was able to be out there with the people, answering questions, getting them into clinics, getting them vaccinated. And so I saw the effects on the community. They couldn't go out anymore. You know, they couldn't go to church. They couldn't go see their families as they did before.
It affected my family and I greatly because we was so used to being out in the public, out in the community, because I work in a nonprofit community. My wife worked into a nonprofit community, and we was kind of like stalemated when we had to stay home. And she did her Zooms, and I could no longer be as free working in the homeless community as I'm so used to doing. COVID now is still here, and that's the sad part about it. And some of us don't realize that it's still a dangerous happening right now in the community, but we still try to go on as normal lives so we can continue to just do what we can do, but COVID is still affecting everyday life. in Rochester.
My background is in mental health counseling, so I became deeply aware of how, the stigma around accessing mental health resources showed up in Black communities, especially around COVID. I think of Black children who really struggled with their mental health, staying home, parents who struggled with using computers and the internet and technology, and how that impacted their overall well-being.
Well, I think for young people, obviously school changed. It got a lot harder for all of us. I feel like it was some of the most rough times for everybody, not just students, but for teachers, parents, and the whole community.
How did you or your family be affected by COVID?
I would say during COVID caused me to drop out because in person and being not in person in school is like completely different scenarios. So I really didn't have the motivation to continue school anymore. But I did get my GED after that, and I'm now working as a teacher's aide. So
the work that I'm doing now, we've been talking to our young people, and they feel that during COVID, people forgot about them. The elders, the community, the adults forgot about them and just left them. And then when COVID started to recede, that we went back to our lives, acted like nothing happened, and they've been left behind.
In the work that we do, for one, we do a tutoring program. And so a lot of the children didn't get the tutoring they needed. Teachers weren't there. There were shortages. And so a lot of those kids lacked some of the fundamentals that they needed to clear that threshold of third grade reading level, fourth grade math level. And today, we're still seeing the effects of that.
So that was a devastating impact to a community that is so close-knit. I think there was also that inspiration and creativity that came out of it, where we had to live a new way, right? That adaptability. We were able to live a new way, and we did it.
We really are change agents, and that we really can adapt to change. And while we live under the auspices of it takes a long time to change, we can change on the dime when we have to.
I think it also unleashed some innovation for the Black community. I saw Black people coming up with small businesses from their homes. They were delivering food, they were delivering drinks, they were, figuring out how to serve each other and serve their community, in a time where it was really hard and scary, I think, for a lot of us.
But COVID provided an opportunity for us to reset as a community how we align our resources and strategies to support those who are most in need.
So we've seen two things kind of emerge. We've seen a plethora of resources pop up to kind of assist these communities, which is great. There's a lot more grants, there's a lot more funding, but we've also seen that the Black community, unfortunately, is still suffering in specifically these highly densely populated, impoverished communities here. But we do find that there are resources we're trying to actively connect them with.
I think we learned a lot more about the physical aspects of racism during the time of COVID than we ever knew before. We always understood there were differences, but we started to be able to pinpoint some of the reasons. So this was an opportunity really showcase why racism is impacting our health, and more than just COVID.
But it's also critically important that Black Rochester aren't just the ones who were in dire straits. There were other parts of Black Rochester too that start to think about how do they spend their dollars in the communities differently, so that we're not relying upon the government and public health entities to solve our community's problems.
And so I think that was one way, and it called us, I think, very strongly to look at these systems. I think we did some work there, but there's so much more to go. We knew we needed a new policing blueprint, but we didn't do it. We settled for nibbling around the edges with reforms that have brought us right back in 2024 with another Black man losing his life as a result of those systems colliding together. And unfortunately, I think we didn't have the political courage to really finish the work of transforming these systems so that not only non-Black communities could thrive, but that Black people could join in that.
From a law enforcement's perspective, we're looking at, the death of Mr. Daniel Prude. And what his death triggered was it was a wake-up call in terms of what our trauma response will be in terms of working with people who have addictions, people who have suffering mental health crisis. 3 months later, we had the death of Mr. George Floyd, and that was also during a COVID epidemic, and people were out there protesting and people out there demonstrating. So the risk that was being taken in our community and across the country, these conditions that produce unimaginable consequences in terms of relationship between police and community, it was worth the risk. Their voices had to be heard.
Not tomorrow, not next year. We're doing this right now. Right now. We're getting our justice right now. Right now. Power to the people.
I once heard a quote that villages are the guardians of tradition and culture, preserving our roots for future generations. This is Montgomery Center. In its heyday, it hosted Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and many others, and was the epicenter for the Black community. This building has fallen into disrepair, and in many ways that's emblematic for the state of our village. Yet, there are aspirations for rebuilding the village. In this section, we'll explore those aspirations.
You know, my short answer is no. You know, I'd say there's perhaps disconnect, not so much lack of a sense of community. You know, I think in Rochester there are several sub-communities. You know, it feels like a small town, small community.
You know, I always say, and I've heard it said by others, Rochester is that small, big city with that small town feel, and kind of everybody who's doing something knows everybody who's doing something. We're like 1 degree, 1.5 degrees of separation. You know, I think community is just different now.
And I think community is something that binds us together, holds us together. And social support is very important, especially in times of difficulty. And without institutions to facilitate our connectedness, we won't be able to support each other in a way that we need for us to be successful.
I feel like community and Black really go together. Like, Black people have always known how to do community. We've relied on community. Without community, we would not survive. When I was growing up, everybody looked out for you, you know, everybody disciplined you, you know, people monitored the children in those communities. And I think there's still pockets of that. I think there's pockets of that. But I think that's our responsibility as elders in the generation to model the sense of community if we want it, and then to support it when we see it.
Being able to learn about what community looked like in the past shows that even more, because we got to learn about how the Clarissa Street neighborhood was, and we learned about how people didn't lock their doors. We learned about how everybody knew everybody. We learned about how if you got in trouble at school, your parent would know before you got home because it would get passed down, and there was just that relationship.
Nowadays, you know, you have folks say mind your own business, or, you know, if you try to discipline a child, you get CPS called on you. And so all of these things just serve to further break up our ability to self-regulate our communities and go from being concentrated in key neighborhoods like the 19th Ward, like Emma Beechwood, like where Fight On was over in the Northeast side, to where now we're geographically dispersed with a lack of population density of folks who all know each other well, who take advantage of the same community resources and are able to come together and work through things.
Black folks who are from the west side, Black folks from the east side. There's Black folks from all over. There's folks that are from the south. Black community that in the college setting are from all different parts of the country, and they have their own community and their own space there. And so when I think about it, whether it being disconnected, I think that there's opportunity for connection. And I really think that if it was more intentional, or if we were just more intentional, I think that those connections could happen organically.
Here I am, born and raised in the projects of Fight Village. Now I consider myself to be successful, moving forward with my children, still here. So there is hope, there is a future. Keep your head up, you got this.
Nguzo Saba says, what can I do all that I can in all the ways that I can to make our community better and more beneficial than we found it? How can we feed into, what are some regular everyday things that we can do to rebuild our village? And sometimes it's just as easy as talking to young people walking down the street, talking to your neighbor. Instead of us being focused on the lack of community, we need to be focused on what can we do from where we sit to rebuild and reestablish our community.
The interaction, I think a lot of mental and emotional distresses have come as a result of the separation of people. We can talk electronically and technologically, but it doesn't take the place of being with folk personally and what comes in that experience.
So I will say it's different now than it was when I first moved here. It was years ago, and at that time, many of the companies put forth a concerted effort to bring African Americans into the Rochester community to work in their companies. And in doing so, that was the creation of networks, of Black networks. And so then you had that group ready to receive you when you came into Rochester. People that I am friends with today were those that welcomed me here, showed me around, told me the places to go and shop and eat, and spent their personal time and invested that time in me for my future and for my development. We don't have that like we used to. I was one of the ones that was a part of the network North Star. I did everything with those guys, and I knew what was going on as a result of that. We had Carrie here at Xerox, and so we partnered with them. So there was this community within the community that kind of looked out after you and showed you the way.
The fact that we are in our silos, we don't have the trust. I think that's the biggest issue. And we don't trust because we don't know each other. And we don't know each other because we don't seek to know each other. We're all doing good in our own worlds. And I think the fact that we're doing good in our own worlds is a disadvantage to our city.
Even in my own organization, we tend to operate in silos, and you ask yourself, why? And I think a lot of it is very protective, right? I got my territory, I'm watching my territory, and I'm like that about Jordan, right? Don't mess with Jordan. I'm looking for money for Jordan. I'm looking for providers for Jordan. So I think, we do get very polarized in our community, and we find it very hard to collaborate at times, even amongst organizations you think would be perfectly aligned.
There are absolutely disconnects among those enclaves. They're frankly parts of the city or of the community that don't interact with, whether it be over class boundaries or otherwise.
But then there is that divide, because I did say anybody who's doing something, right? So there's that divide with folks who are not as engaged.
So on one side of the discussion, there is a lot of community. There are a lot of events, there's a lot of collectives, a lot of group in the arts realm that are doing great things, like the ninth floor, so to speak, art collective, as well as the Black Arts Council. You have the Black Agenda, that's kind of an older group of activists, generally speaking. And you have Community Justice Initiative, and you have Rock the Peace, Rise of Rochester. So you do have a lot of different groups that do work together. Have we addressed the encampments? That seems to be somewhat of a marker or indicator that maybe our unity isn't quite where it needs to be, or our community isn't quite where it needs to be. Those resources, we want to drive those resources to all of the places where all of the people we serve actually are.
There's definitely a divide. There's definitely, I would say the biggest one is class divide, right? There are Black people in leadership who seem to have more alliance and allegiance to others within their class, and they are focused on accumulating more wealth for themselves and their class, and others in the working class are left behind. So I think the biggest difference we see is by class, and the outcomes for Black folks with more money, with more power are definitely different than the working class Black people in our community.
As Black people, we don't always know what we don't know. And so when we come into positions of power, when we do not have role models, we emulate power in the way that the oppressor has historically used it over us. And so as we go up into upward mobility and we're looking at the definition of community, a community in the suburb is not like a community in the city where you don't know your neighbor's name and you need to shovel your snow because the neighbors shoveled their snow. It's more competitive. It's more let's keep up with one another. There's just so much that we can learn from the concentrated poverty communities because they get it. They understand that we need one another in order to survive.
Between these communities, there's a lack of an opportunity for the youth to really connect with the older working professionals and then also their elders. So I think there needs to be an emphasis on bridging these communities, finding ways for all of us to be in the same room, have conversations with one another.
A lack of vision, a lack of understanding that we need to work together as a community. Black and white and brown-skinned people need to work together. I mean, there's so much division in the city of Rochester that we try to put our head in the sand and pretend it's not there. Because every now and then we see a spark of unity, a spark of a light and goodness, but in general, it's still the same. The same as I was when I was a young teenager fighting for justice. We're still fighting for justice today.
I think we have broken relationships. And in our broken relationships, it is naturally a time where we can work through those relationships because that's how relationships work. Family members fall apart sometimes, but through the process of working through those crisis moments, you become more strengthened. We're a family in Rochester. We all know each other. Sometimes we may not all like each other. We respect each other, we walk away, and we have a greater capacity to be honest with each other, be forgiving with each other, and do what the scripture says we should do. Take care of each other. I am my brother's keeper.
The inimitable James Baldwin was interviewed by Esquire magazine on the conditions of urban life in America. When asked about the emerging suburbs and the disparities that exist in urban life and the willingness of the American people to address those disparities, his response, well, that depends on the will of the American people, doesn't it? That's why they are in the suburbs, to get away from me. There are a growing number of Black people in the suburbs that surround Rochester. We asked in this section about the experiences of Black people in the suburbs, in our urban communities, and the relation between the two.
Maybe 100 years of social science research that has identified neighborhood characteristics as one of the key factors that influences development. And some more recent research has found one of the biggest challenges in places like Rochester is that there's tremendous inequality within the Black community. So you'll find, for instance, people who live in suburban settings accessing institutions, accessing places where there's investment in a way that will allow them and their children to be successful in accessing opportunity. Whereas some of our neighborhoods in Rochester, for instance, are in the 98th percentile for poverty, meaning that there's only 2% of other neighborhoods in the country that are as poor as some of our neighborhoods in Rochester.
There's no doubt there are two Black Rochesters, two Black communities in Rochester. There are the individuals that come to our food pantry, those that need clothing and emergency services assistance. they can't even go to a grocery store. There's no grocery store in the neighborhood. That's if they had the funds to pay for the food.
What the trauma that's been enforced upon them from generations prior are still affecting their day-to-day. So it would be almost an oversight to say that that Black Americans in the city of Rochester are on the same footing as Black Americans maybe in Pittsford or in Henrietta. They have access to different resources. They have an access to different types of housing and opportunities. So I've 100% noticed that there's a difference there.
I mean, I know there's a difference just from being in like a program at school where we learn, it's for people who want to be teachers. We learn about how suburban schools, we learn about how the taxes fund that school and because of home ownership. And we don't have that in the city because there's not a lot of home ownership. So our schools struggle more to get money.
Where their friends were like, you missed all the stuff on the block because you were never around. You were always in a program or in a camp or in a thing. For a lot of suburban kids, depending on where you live in the suburbs, it's not equitable, right? Because you can live in Parenton or you can live in the Pines of Parenton, which is a very different, it's the same town, but very different experiences. So just like Blackness is not a monolith, even within our geographic experience, there's deep levels of difference, diversity, and sometimes even disparity.
Growing up in the city, you saw what was in your neighborhood, and oftentimes if you went outside of that neighborhood, it was because you were going to the mall or going to the beach or something to that effect, or a family member was going to work in the suburbs. Whereas folks in the suburbs that grow up Black generally have access to the entire Finger Lakes region. You know, I got it as a RCSD school child at 33 school, field trips going out to the canal in Fairport. It wasn't everyday life.
So there's messages, I think, that are really different. Children in suburban areas tend to be provided more safe spaces to be children, more resources and investment in their communities so that there's more things to do and to kind of take them away from the streets that is always calling children, whether you're an urban child or a suburban child. But those protections and those insulations are not present in urban areas for Black children particularly.
And then going out into the suburbs, you know, my one memory was when I first got there, all I could remember was it's like thinking to myself, why am I here? And then how come people don't look like me? And then I was really upset at my parents because I was like, why do you have me out here with all these white people? Classmates asking me like, you know, do you live out here? Yeah, I live out here. We own a house. We're here, you know, but there was that stigma that, you know, if you were Black, you either were using someone else's address or you were living in the apartments. But no, my dad and my mom, we own the house. As a matter of fact, the house was just about brand new when they bought it.
It's way different, like once you go to Irondequoit or you go to Greece or you go to Gates or in Chili, or if I go right now to East Avenue, you know what I'm saying? It's like, it's a whole different environment. And you can see like in the center of the city, it's more people of color, Black people, you know? And it's a little bit of white people, whatever. But as you get more out, it's more white people. And I have some friends who actually live in the suburbs, and it's like, it's crazy because they don't see, you know, race as an issue, but it's like, that's because, you know, they were in them schools, or it's just not as, it doesn't click for them.
And I've lived in both, you know. When my son was going into school and the trauma that he experienced going through a metal detector and being treated like a criminal because the school to prison pipeline is real, I said, okay, let's move out into the suburbs. We moved out into the suburbs and race was rampant. I was Black living in the suburb, so I must have lived in a project in the suburb. I must have been an implant there, maybe from Section 8. That was the response not only from white people, but from Black people as well. And so race was an issue, race and anti-Blackness. And my son would come home crying sometimes because of the racism that he experienced in the suburbs. And then the moment he graduated, we moved back into the city. City is class. What part of the city do you live in? Do you own? Do you rent? is dependent upon how you were treated in both cultures, whether it be white or black. Black is class, white is racist.
Zip code matters, but it's because race matters. And I think we kind of got it twisted just a bit. Oh, I had to go for an emergency at the hospital. And the questions were about my insurance. Oh, you have insurance? Like, yeah. You work? I'm like, yeah, and I was a physician.
For those who are African Americans that live in suburbs and may have opportunities that people in the city or experiences that are different because you live in the city, it may not necessarily be better. But the experiences of racism and hate and bias is universal. It's a false narrative to think for some people that this doesn't exist for African American people outside the community. In some cases, it might be worse. They're just more silent about it.
Well, we forget that black people live in Greece. We forget that black people are in Chilai, in Henrietta, in Pittsford, and they're still black out there, and they're still experiencing those neighborhoods as black people. And sometimes that experience could be harder because they don't have more community around them, right? They don't have that neighbor, that black neighbor, that they can go knock on the door because they might be a little bit isolated. I work specifically on the commission on racial and structural equity, and that commission was meant to look at inequities in the black and brown communities. And so as we work on that, people tend to focus on the city. And I have to constantly remind them that this is a county issue and that everywhere across the county is involved in this work. So it definitely does happen, but we have to remind people.
Well, as a lifelong Rochesterian, I've seen the change come about. I was born and raised here in Rochester. I went through urban renewal in the 60s, and I survived that. And I see the suburban flight. I've witnessed all that. As a matter of fact, I'm part of that now, I guess you would call it, because I live in Chilai, but I still do a lot of community work. I go to church. I do everything here in Rochester. So I think it's gotten better, but it could always get much better.
Most of us may live and sleep in one area, but when we come together within the city of Rochester. And the city of Rochester must create additional gathering spots for us. They must bring people here to live, work, and play, as opposed to allowing us to be siloed and separated within our own suburban or rural communities.
You know, when I think about it, I don't think about it from that individualistic perspective of, you know, the individual person living in the city versus the individual living in the suburbs. I think of it systemically, you know, and so I think that in order to get back to a point, which is both my personal but also professional mission at Rock the Future Alliance, where we have equity across systems, we have to have that kind of systemic lens. We have to investigate those root causes of where these phenomena come from. And we have to make reinvestments, you know, in places that have been underinvested or de-invested in historically.
We have to remember that there are multiple classes in Rochester. So we have lower income, but we have middle income Rochester. And so they both can live in the suburban and urban area, but I think it's the connection to the cause, connection to what's happening in our community, and also the urgency that we create. So I think if there is a us versus them or urban versus suburban, it's up to us, our community, to change that, to make sure that we have one purpose in mind and making sure that there's a pathway for upward mobility for us, for Black and brown people.
I live in the city, and I think I live in one of the nicer neighborhoods of the city. But I also hear the sirens running at night. I hear the gunshots in the middle of the night. I see the crime. And one of the reasons why I try to stay in the trenches because it affects me. And I think the difference is when you are in it, you seem to care. It's not helping them. When you're in it, it's helping us.
One of our greatest citizens, Frederick Douglass, once said, "We have to do with the past only as we can make it useful for the present and the future." We are at an interesting moment with a rising generation of new leaders, and those leaders have to determine what from our past is most effective to make a vibrant future. Now with new leaders comes new opportunity, opportunities for collaboration and for partnership and for innovation. But it also brings an obligation to our community.
I am so deeply moved by younger folks, even younger than myself, like Isaiah Santiago, who is just incredible and amazing, and Halima, and so many young students like Sarah Adams, you know, just really leading by listening to the people who are generally forgotten. And we have a powerful grassroots movement around housing, around childcare, around so many issues that we see are forgotten by people who have previously represented us. So as a person who's a part of this new generation, I see things differently. I see a long struggle ahead, but I know that we have the tools and the resources to really empower our community and thrive here in Rochester.
Yeah. I think the leadership in Rochester is going in a good direction. I think you have kind of a new generation of folks that are stepping it up, particularly in the streets. You know, folks that may have not had as much of a stable home situation, maybe not enough unity in their homes. And so as a result of that, the streets kind of become the default kind of family unit, or whichever way you will word that, like, so folks like feel that. And I think your Devin Bays, your Anthony Hall figures, you know, and even like a Justin Morris, these have been some brothers that have done some great work. And there's plenty of others, Tony Nelson, and then Wanda Ridgway, you know, Serena Cotton, that group of people.
It's amazing to see faces that look like mine, faces that look like all of ours on these stages, sitting on these panels, having these conversations and representing us in ways that we need it. So I think it's affirming that we're moving in a good direction. It's inspiring as someone who's still kind of young, still just going through graduate school now. I'm still trying to make my footing out in the world. It's inspiring to see so many leaders doing this work and are consistently doing it and have made names for themselves.
I think first thing is that, you know, we're standing on the shoulders of giants, right? And there are many people who have paved the way for opportunities for people like me, to allow people like me to now have leadership opportunities and positions. I think we're at a point now where we have Black leadership that has experience in the community, that's qualified, and that's well positioned to think about how we transform the Rochester region, but also really get our hands dirty and tackle some of these problems that are seemingly intractable, but that we know that if we work collectively together, that we can overcome.
It truly is passing on of the baton. We've had great Black leaders that have you know, trained us, that have a model for us what excellence looks like, what equity looks like, what reinvestment in our community looks like. And so a lot of these Black leaders that are newer, including myself, are stepping into these roles, having been given great talent, great investment, great resources.
I would think that one of the most great levelers that we have available to us is time. And so we're at this chasm where you have population shift, where the baby boomer generation, the Gen X generation, the earlier part of the Gen X generation is exiting the workforce, is exiting public stations and spaces. And you have this next generation that had a whole different cohort of experiences in their developmental journey, now beginning to take their respective stations in the workforce, in academia or the academy, in public life. And so between folks coming up here because they're connected to family, or because of folks just coming up and saying, I don't want to be like what we have come from, I want to make it better, you have this new opportunity. And I think that things like technology further lends itself because their exposure is global, their mindset is international. And so they're bringing new ideas and new possibilities, and that in-between generation, my generation, millennials, we have the promise now to really make a difference because we're occupying spaces like Simeon Bannister's seat at the Community Foundation or Jamu Kitwana's seat over at ESL. And in my seat as a local CEO and the organization that's managing the Rochester Economic Development Corporation, that is unheard of, to have so many of us positioned to be able to make an impact or change in our community.
I think a lot of us, fortunately, have been working together over the years. So we've arrived together and we're used to collaborating. We don't compete, and understanding that, to have good health, you need to have a job, right? You need good education. You need, so that's why we have to do it together, because it won't work unless we all go forward together.
Black folk understand Black folk issues. Others may empathize, but they cannot identify. And so even though their heart is in the right place, they care, and I'm talking about non-Blacks right now, their heart is in the right place, they genuinely care, but they don't know the reality of what Black folk experience. Even though they read in books certain things, they've had persons tell them certain things, they don't know the feelings that come with it. So when you have Black folk in the courtroom, part of the jury pool, or maybe even the captain, there are things that are said and words that we may use that non-Blacks may not be able to identify exactly what is meant. And I'm thinking right now of Floyd Madison, a former fire chief of the Rochester Fire Department, Black guy. And he happened to be on the jury pool and the captain, if you will. Well, something was said that all the other jurors were non-Black. And they interpreted it one way, but he was able to bring light to it. And now they were able to reconsider the matter. And so I believe Black leadership is important on every level. You name the level, we need to be there.
I'm very close to one young man who, in particular, who's a young man who just got elected to a position on the city school board. And I think one of the things, even though we're excited about it, we as elders have an opportunity and requirement to nurture them and bring them along. We keep in mind that, some of them are so powerful in their conversations, they're so powerful in their thoughts, they're still young people and they're still gonna make mistakes. And making those mistakes, if we're so excited about them and their future, then we have to cover them in a way where they don't burn out. And even having to sometimes step aside just to say, you take the lead, or us doing active listening to certain concerns they may have, even if they're about us. I think one of the things that we have to realize as an older population, this young population is going to hold us accountable.
I've said before, and I say it again, that at this point in my life, I have more years behind me than I do ahead. And my job is to have my foot, use the privilege and the access that I had to keep the foot in the door to push in this new level of Black leadership and to offer what I can to them. I am excited too about the new Black leadership. And the thing that I'm excited about in particular for a subset of these young people is the fact that they understand that there are new ways, but they don't forsake the old, right? Just because something is older does not mean that it's no good, or it may have been something that wasn't the right thing in the wrong time. So having the new generation of leaders who are able to do the Sankofa, to reach back and pull back those things, get those things that we can take to move forward, is really exciting to me. And it's exciting to me to be in this space of age and time that I can lend what support I can to put the wind at their back.
Fraternities and sororities through different organizations that exist in Rochester, just seeing the connections between folks who are leading in different businesses and organizations. We have, people that are in the marketing world, we have those that are in business, we have those that are in the religious communities. I really see us really being able to do something very significant and special here in Rochester. And it's gonna take some time, but I think if we can think of it as each of us has a specific talent and a specific thing that we're good at, how do we bring those things together? And I really think the leadership is really doing that.
I don't think it's just about, yes, we have Black leadership, but there's still it's about doing what's right for the people. And there's some Black leaders who aren't necessarily doing that. So I think it's not just about having Black leadership, but also having people who are there to do work for the people and, you know, actually put us first.
As a new leader myself, at the helm of the YWCA of Rochester and Monroe County, my appointment to that position is historic in that organization existed in this community for 140 years and had not had a leader of color until I arrived a few short years ago. As a native Rochesterian, I think there is a sea change of leadership and opportunity to re-engage with the community, re-engage with our neighbors that live on the margins, and to also re-engage with our partners who help us do the great work to uplift the voices, all voices in the community. So I'm excited.
Very segmented where we see that Black leadership. So definitely see it in the nonprofit sector more so. I haven't seen it in the for-profit sector as much. When we look at the people that we're serving in the nonprofit sector, it makes sense that the leadership looks like that community. Agencies where the retiree was the same race as the executive that came on, it was fine, right? So if the retiree was Black and the new leader was Black, that worked. If they were, Latino and the new leader was Latino, that was fine. But in those agencies where the race changed, so it went from a white leader to a leader of color, be it Black, Latino, Asian, those leaders were out within a year or two, right? And that was really devastating to the community because it showed, well, maybe we're not as ready as we thought. And so we're seeing that leadership now. I'm happy to see it. I know that we have a lot of the right leaders in place to truly capitalize on the moment and make the changes that we need to make Rochester as equitable as it can be.
So even with that excitement, we have to keep in mind that there's still a lot of work to do. I'm still excited about the progress that we've made, but there's a lot of work to do. So absolutely, we should be excited. There are new leaders that are centering equity, which is exciting that equity is at the forefront of everything that we do, just even in this context of this conversation here. Equity is being centered, but certainly we still have a pathway to get us to where we ultimately want to be in closing that wealth income gap.
I think Black people historically have, even when we achieve, we've walked or felt the sense of, hey, they are only gonna let us get this, or they're, so we felt like we achieve things in the context of something where someone else was really in control. Today, in Rochester in particular, I think Black people are in leadership positions. Obviously not unlimited power, but if you're the mayor of the city, you're the CEO of the biggest foundation, you've got the levers of control. The challenge now is, what are you going to do with that?
The number of Black leadership is exciting, but we need Sojourner Truths, John Lewis's, Harriet Tubman's, Ida B. Wells. So now it's time for us to move away from the numbers because we've succeeded. Now what's next? It's the quality. How do we step into our political power collectively to raise hell and tear down these systems that do not benefit us, do not work for us, whether we are elected in them or whether we are pushing against them from the bottom up? Until we change the white structures and the white systems, it isn't gonna matter.
We were able to see people who have been in the trenches working, that perhaps have never received press, perhaps have never received a thank you, who were not motivated by self-interest, who do not want their names written on a billboard, but they are motivated by a desire to help somebody, by a desire to make a difference, a desire to make this world better. So once more, our eyes were open to those who have been doing the work, who don't need fanfare, but as long as they have given the best of their service, that's their well done.
I would like to see us talk to the people Talk to the mothers who are having problems with their children. Talk to the fathers who are having problems with their sons. Talk to the couples, the mothers, the husbands and wives. Talk to the people who are impoverished in this city, and build our agenda on that data versus all of us who are doing well. Come to the table and we create an agenda that we think is good for the people without talking to the people. I've done enough of that. I've done enough of that. Now I want to build the sidewalks where the people are walking. I want to meet the people where they are. I'd like to see our city do that.
Throughout this film, we've been on a journey to explore the state of Black Rochester. And along this journey, we've made some stops, exploring the impact of COVID and narrative on Black people in Rochester. We've asked the question about the state of the village and how and whether it needs to be rebuilt. We've looked at the differential experiences between suburban and urban Black Rochesterians, and we've asked the question of a rising generation of new leaders. Now, at the outset of this film, we acknowledge that it is a misnomer to think of a single state of Black Rochester. But in fact, there are a multitude of experiences that constitute what it means to be Black across this community. So because we've been on a journey, you may be asking yourself, where does this road lead? And I want to offer to you 3 next stops. Number 1, educate. Number 2, organize. And number 3, act. To educate yourself, visit stateofblackrochester.org. And there you'll see additional data, analysis, and narrative to help gain a comprehensive understanding of the Black experience in Rochester. Second, I want you to use those insights to organize with your neighbors, with your friends, with your family, with your houses of worship, your organizations, with other civic institutions, to amplify our strengths and to address our opportunities for growth. And finally, I want you to act. It is not enough to have insights or even to gather to develop a strategy. This moment requires that we take action. Frederick Douglass once said, "I prayed for freedom for 20 years and received no answer until I prayed with my legs." We have made progress, but in this moment of national regression, confronting our local challenges in order to secure a vibrant future for the state of Black Rochester, we must act now.